Howdy. Welcome back to another Schizoid rant. I apologize. These are probably getting kind of old, but there was a topic that's been popping up on my last few videos that I kind of wanted to talk about for a second. It was about, fantasy life. I've kind of made a video on it before when I was talking about maladaptive daydreaming disorder. This is kind of similar. It's been talking about the relation between people with SPD and their fantasy lives. I know a lot of personality disorders entail, people having these elaborate fantasy lives, and I know schizoid is not exempt from that. But I kind of wanted to start out with a story, something that kind of used to happen to me when I was a kid. As a kid, I've been like this my whole life, the SPD lifestyle, really antisocial, not really feeling too much of anything, or didn't really express too much feeling towards anything. And as a kid, I still had a normal kid mind besides, the whole SPD thing. But like at nighttime, we lived in a trailer and it was kind of long, and on one end of the trailer it was my parents' room, and the other end of the trailer was my room, and I was an only child at this point in time, and the hallway in between leading out to the living room from my room kind of went out into a hallway, and then there was a living room, but in the hallway didn't have any lights and it was really dark, so my kid mind, I never really, I always had my door shut because when it was open, I could like see out into the hallway from where my bed was, and I would always like see shadows and stuff doing weird things in the hallway and stuff. As a kid, my mind, kid minds. But the window in my room, it fit. It was like directly in the center of that wall, and where the moon would shine directly into that window. So there was always a little bit of light in my room. I didn't really need a nightlight, and I always had my toy box underneath the window, and I'd always lay my clothes out on it for the next morning for school. I was a weird kid. But every night, just the way the moon would shine in the moonlight and the shadows that my toy box would cast and everything like that, it made it look like there was a dark figure at the end of my bed. It was there every night, just the way the light would shine in the room. And it scared the crap out of me as a kid. Obviously I knew that there was nothing really there, but I was always scared, so I always slept with my head under the blankets, right? Because that always made me feel safe for some reason. I always sleep with my head under the I remember one night I had to go to the bathroom really bad, and I opened my door, and I couldn't walk out into the hallway because it was dark, and I was too scared. I didn't want the shadows to get me, and I didn't want to turn my back on the figure at the end of my bed because it scared the crap out of me. So I just laid in bed, eventually I ended up wetting myself, and I slept in it pretty much all night until the sun started coming up, where I was brave enough to go out and get myself cleaned up. I know that sounds kind of gross, but I wanted to share that story because to kind of describe the people, with SPD and how they think when they're not in their fantasy lives, when they're not, well, first I should probably say, like, when I was a kid, like I said, I was mostly a normal kid mind, and I always think about being a ninja or a Power Ranger or some kind of superhero but in those fantasies I would always fight for a reason. I was fighting for something, and then I didn't have to put on a mask in those fantasies. It was always natural to me. I was always fighting to save a girl, or just normal things that kids think about. And those kind of fantasy lives, they were pretty much normal at the time. Those weren't really unusual. But when I wasn't in those, thinking about this stuff, daydreaming, if you will, you're just a really alone feeling. And the reason I told that story was because, most kids, a lot of normal kids, when something scares them, probably call for their parents or their friends and brother or sister in the next room, whatever. In my case, the parents were just on the other end of the house. I could have screamed for them, but me being the way that I am, I was scared shitless. I didn't think about, anything like that. People with SPD generally don't. They don't really care about their available connections, their available help in the area. They don't really care too much about any of these things. So in my mind, I'm sitting there, I'm like, well, this sucks, so I just wet myself and just dealt with it. And that's what I kind of wanted to talk about with this whole fantasy thing. Because, that coupled with being adopted at the time, I knew that I was adopted. And so knowing something like that at that young of an age, I grew, the first few years when I was old enough to understand the way the world works, I grew up thinking that, these were my parents, these were my family, and you find out that's a lie. So you kind of develop this thing that these things in life that you want and like, they're not real. And it kind of sticks with you through everything. Things that you normally would want and go after, you just kind of have this underlying feeling that they're not real. So you kind of start suppressing these emotions, these wants, like you want these friendships and relationships, whatever, but they just don't feel real. Is like kind of a distrust, I guess, just from the being adopted side of things, just knowing that and being told that at a really young age. I had that ingrained in me. So I think that's kind of what contributed to my lifestyle now, the way that I am, and the whole mask and everything. You suppress all these emotions, and eventually it becomes natural just to stop wanting these things, and you don't seek out relationships. In fact, you're very antisocial because of this kind of lifestyle, this view, this outlook on life. And I'm not really talking about SPD now, I'm talking about being adopted, but they kind of go hand in hand in this story. But that's kind of how the mask is born, because just as an example, like the person I was calling mom at the time kind of noticed that I was being different, really antisocial, didn't never have friends come over, didn't want to go out with friends after school, just come home and be in my room every day, all day. And I was fine with that. But she took me to a psychologist one day, and this was shortly after I had my tonsils removed. And I remember sitting in on that, and the psychologist's exact words was that I had a piece of me removed, so I was going to be depressed. It was only natural, and because I just had my tonsils removed. And even as a kid, I'm sitting there, really young age, and that was the most BS answer I'd ever heard to anything. I'm just sitting there. And just that in itself, even for the kind of views that I had, ingrained in me, just from that experience on these people who are licensed to, help people and, dish out medicines and treatments and all this stuff, I just learned not to really trust and believe anything they say either, because, 7 years old, I could call BS on an answer like that. I did have my tonsils removed, but it was before that when I was like this. And anyways, that's just kind of what I wanted to talk about, because even now this whole fantasy life it stuck with me throughout these years growing up. It always stuck with me, like when a normal kid and you're playing baseball or something, you break a window and you think, oh, I'm going to get yelled at, and you kind of imagine the kind of stuff that's going to happen to you. It's kind of the same thing, but like with me, when I'm imagining these things, I would imagine word for word the conversations, and in such detail to an extent that I would start having body languages, and I'd start talking to myself, going back and forth in this conversation to myself in my mind. I'd be physically saying these things out loud. And I remember one day I was outside playing in the yard, and I was having one of these conversations with myself, body movements and everything. And I went back inside, and my dad had asked me, who I was talking to, or like what was I saying, stuff like that. And that kind of really hit me. I was like, whoa, this is coming out, because obviously I knew that I wasn't really talking to anybody physically there, and it was all in my mind, and I was pretty much in a daydreaming state, but I was physically talking and moving and stuff, interacting with this other entity that I was talking to. And that fantasy life, that's how strong it is when you don't have, or you're not able to express emotions and concerns and wants and needs. In the real world, your brain kind of compensates by creating this fantasy life where you can have those things. You can relate and want and love and need, all these things that are life feelings and emotions. Not to say that people with SPD don't have these, because they do, just a lot of times they have trouble expressing them, or they don't understand them. I know in my case, and I know a lot of people like this will probably be in my position, because coupled with being adopted and being an only child for a while, and that all contributed to the way that I am and having SPD. But like I said, even before I found out that I was adopted, I was always like this, really antisocial, had a different outlook on life, and that just kind of compounded it, and it made the whole fantasy life, I guess is what we'll call it. My fantasy is way stronger, way more detailed and in depth, because it was just, I started relying on these things. I would spend hours in my room just daydreaming and just living in this life because I could have fun there. I mean, I had a lot of friends there, and I didn't have to wear a mask. I didn't have to fake anything. I didn't have to worry about things not being real, because I controlled it. It was in my head. And it just kind of became a thing that I held on to. Kind of like, you hear a lot of stories about people growing up, it might suck their thumb because it makes them feel more comfortable for whatever reason as they get older. It's kind of the same thing. This fantasy life was just something that kind of made me more comfortable, something I could hold on to keep me sane. A place where I could express these emotions where I couldn't in the real world because for whatever reason. But that's kind of what I wanted to talk about. Sorry, the correlation, between SPD and the fantasy life, because I know a lot of people that have SPD have these extremely elaborate fantasy lives. I mean, they have stories and movies, and they could write books on these lives that they have in their heads, and I could too, and in such detail, and it's so intense sometimes that it physically manifests itself. Like I said, even at a very young age, I was having conversations pretty much with myself, which, I mean, sounds kind of scary if you were to see that from a third person. Yeah, like I said, just that I was, a lot of it for me was based on a mistrust in the world and anything that I thought that I wanted. Like a lot of these words that mean a lot to people, like family, and like words like mom and dad or brother and sister, had no weight to me because when I used those words, I thought that they were real, and then I found out that I was just kind of put in that position, and I started calling these people mom and dad. They weren't actually my mom and dad. And so those words held no meaning for me anymore. They didn't mean anything. Even after I'd bounced around to a couple different people that were members of a family, and people that I'd call mom and dad. It kind of fluctuated throughout the years, so those words held no meaning to me. They just kind of became words to describe people that you would see when you weren't working or when you weren't at school, people that you helped take care of and people that helped take care of you. You lived in the same household. That's what family meant to me, just living around these people. It didn't actually mean what it would mean to other people, brothers, sisters, just describing that person that I would just call him a friend. Not to say that I don't love the people that I consider family now. I really do. My mom and dad the people that I call mom and dad now, I really am grateful that they're in my life. I don't talk to them as much as I should, obviously, but yeah, just that fantasy life was just a place to go to escape all of these things. But for me, it was based on a mistrust of the world and the fact that I had problems expressing emotions and feeling emotions in the real life. I needed a way to do these things to stay sane. It was a natural reaction to life, just to survive. If I didn't have these things, if I didn't have a way to get what I needed from myself because I wasn't getting from anywhere else, if I didn't have a way to get these emotions, I would have went crazy. I wouldn't have lived for too long. I'm not even just talking about suicide. I mean, it's not, as a human, you need a certain amount of connection with other humans. If you were stuck on an island, didn't see another human, I mean, you'd go crazy pretty fast, a lot faster than you would think, and that's kind of where this fantasy life comes from. It's just, it comes out of an instinctual need as a human being to have these things, and I was thinking back, and I rewatched that video a couple times on maladaptive daydreaming disorder, and it kind of, I was sitting there agreeing with myself, even though it was my video. That sounds kind of arrogant, but when I was talking about maladaptive daydreaming disorder, because a lot of people can probably relate to what I just said about having this fantasy life and daydreaming. You can't really help it sometimes, and sometimes it's so real that it governs your life, and it controls a lot of things. But the actual daydreaming wasn't the problem. The problem was my situation in life, not having, knowing that I didn't know any blood relatives. I didn't have any blood relatives. I didn't really have any friends. I had no want to have any friends. I couldn't express any emotions. I couldn't feel love. I felt extreme apathy. Like when I was in school and I'd see somebody else fall down, I would get extremely embarrassed, but that was the only time I could feel emotions, is when I'd see it through other people. It's like living it through them. If I seen a couple in Walmart kissing, I'd be like, oh, that's cute. But that was the extent of it, and that's it. All of that contributed to this fantasy life that I've been talking about, and all of that kind of led to the whole mask being born thing, faking emotions and stuff like that. Because, like I said, after the person I was calling mom at the time, took me to see that psychologist, I was like, you know what, I can't live my life like this, and so I started faking emotions. The mask just kind of was born from that whole thing. At a very young age, I was able to realize that this, if I don't put, a mask on, people are going to see me and freak out. And that leads to a lot of other problems I might talk about later, but the fantasy life plays a very big role in a lot of people who have personality disorders. This fantasy life, it does govern and change a lot of things in their life. If you were to take that away from them, they probably wouldn't last too much longer. It's an outlet for them. It's something that they need in their lives. But like I said, going back to the whole maladaptive daydreaming disorder thing, it's like I said in that video, it's something definitely that deserves to be talked about and researched, and studied and stuff like that. But it's not the problem. It's a symptom, and I will reinforce that to the ends of the earth. Just looking back on my story, I'm sorry to repeat myself, but if I was treated for all these daydreaming and stuff, it wouldn't have changed anything. It wouldn't have. In fact, it might have made things worse. Taking away my fantasy life, taking away that outlet for me, would have made things so much worse for me. So that's not a disorder in itself. It's a symptom of something, whatever it is. But sorry for kind of going back and forth this whole rant. But hopefully you kind of got something out of it. I know that there was a few people asking questions about this and questions about the way it affects me personally. Hopefully I answered some of those questions. I was kind of winging this whole thing. But yeah, I'm sorry for that. And I hope I answered some questions. And I will see you guys next time.